The subway was packed, people lost in their own worlds, staring at phones, avoiding eye contact. A pregnant woman stepped in, visibly exhausted, her hand resting on her swollen belly. She scanned the car, hoping for a seat, but no one moved except for one man. Dressed in a simple jacket and jeans, Keanu Reeves stood up and motioned for her to sit. She hesitated, recognizing him, but he just smiled. "Please, you and the baby should be comfortable." She sat down, grateful, while whispers spread around. Then, an elderly woman lost her balance as the train jolted. Keanu caught her just in time. She looked up, smiled, and said 3 words that left him speechless. Keanu Reeves sat quietly on the subway, blending into the crowd as he always did. Dressed in a simple black jacket and worn-out jeans, he looked like any other commuter, lost in thought, listening to the rhythm of the train as it sped through the city. He had always loved taking public transport. There was something grounding about it, something real. He had spent decades in Hollywood, surrounded by luxury. Yet here, on this subway, he was just another passenger, no cameras, no flashing lights, no expectations. As the train rumbled to a stop, more people boarded, the already crowded car filling up. A woman stepped in, carefully maneuvering her way through the standing passengers. She looked exhausted, her face slightly pale, her hand instinctively resting on her swollen belly. She was heavily pregnant, and though no one said anything, it was clear she needed a seat. Keanu's eyes immediately went to her, watching as she glanced around. There were plenty of passengers seated, some pretending not to notice her, others avoiding eye contact altogether. A few had their faces buried in their phones, their headphones plugged in, lost in their own worlds. The woman bit her lip, swaying slightly as the train lurched forward. Without hesitation, Keanu stood up. He motioned toward his seat, offering it to her with a small smile. "Here, please," he said in his usual soft-spoken voice. The woman's eyes widened in surprise. She hesitated for a moment, glancing up at him, then at the seat. Recognition flickered in her expression, but it wasn't the kind of recognition that led to gasps or demands for selfies. Instead, it was quiet, a moment of shared humanity. "Oh, thank you," she said, carefully lowering herself into the seat with a relieved sigh. Keanu simply nodded and grabbed the overhead rail, steadying himself as the train continued on its journey. A few people nearby noticed what had just happened, some whispering to each other, others stealing glances at the man who had just given up his seat. One man sitting across from them scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Wow, what a gentleman," he muttered sarcastically. "You'd think someone like you would have a private driver or something." Keanu turned his head, meeting the man's gaze with a calm, unreadable expression. He had encountered people like this before, those who assumed that kindness was performative, that celebrities only did good things when cameras were watching. But Keanu didn't need validation. He had always believed that being a good person had nothing to do with status, nothing to do with wealth. It was simply the right thing to do. "I like taking the subway," Keanu replied with a small shrug. "Gets me where I need to go." The man huffed, clearly unimpressed, but the conversation ended there. The pregnant woman, now comfortable in her seat, turned to Keanu with a warm smile. "I really appreciate this," she said. "It's been a long day," and standing on a moving train, she shook her head. "It's harder than it looks." "No problem at all," Keanu said. "You and the baby should be comfortable." She chuckled. "Yeah, well, he's already kicking up a storm. Feels like he's trying to run a marathon in there." Keanu smiled at that, his heart warming. There was something beautiful about small moments like these, simple human interactions that reminded him of what really mattered. As the train neared its next stop, an elderly woman standing nearby suddenly lost her balance when the train jolted unexpectedly. Keanu, still holding onto the rail, instinctively reached out, steadying her before she could fall. "Careful," he said, his voice full of concern. The woman looked up at him, her wrinkled hands clutching his arm for support. Then, her eyes widened as she took in his face. A slow smile spread across her lips. "Well, I'll be," she murmured, her voice full of warmth. Keanu Reeves. A few passengers turned their heads now, curiosity piqued. Keanu chuckled softly, helping her regain her footing. "Just another commuter today, ma'am." She patted his arm gently. "Your mother raised you well, young man." For some reason, those words struck him deeper than he expected. A familiar warmth spread through him, a bittersweet ache of memory. His mother had raised him well. She had taught him kindness, humility, and the importance of always treating people with respect, no matter who they were. Keanu gave the elderly woman a genuine smile. "Thank you. That means a lot." The train doors opened at the next stop, and the woman stepped off, giving him one last nod before disappearing into the crowd. The pregnant woman, still seated, watched the interaction with admiration. "You really are as kind as they say," she said softly. Keanu looked down, a little embarrassed. Just doing what anyone should. The train continued its journey, and as Keanu stood there, he felt a sense of quiet contentment. He hadn't done anything extraordinary. He hadn't saved the world, hadn't made some grand gesture. He had simply given up his seat, helped someone stand, exchanged a few words that made people smile. And yet, sometimes, those small moments were enough to remind him why he still believed in the goodness of people. As the train approached his stop, he gave the pregnant woman one last nod. "Take care of yourself," he said. She smiled warmly, placing a hand over her belly. "I will. And thank you again." Keanu gave a small wave before stepping toward the doors, gripping the metal pole as the train slowed. Around him, a few passengers exchanged glances, some whispering amongst themselves, realizing who he was. But Keanu didn't acknowledge the murmurs. To him, none of this had been about recognition. It was just about doing what was right. Just before he stepped off, the elderly woman he had helped earlier called out to him. "Young man." He turned back. She smiled knowingly. "The world needs more people like you." Keanu chuckled softly, nodding in appreciation. "We all can be." As he exited the train and disappeared into the crowd, he left behind more than just an empty seat. He left behind a reminder that kindness wasn't about fame, fortune, or recognition. It was about the simple human choice to care. And sometimes, those small moments had the greatest impact of all. She smiled. "You too." Keanu stepped off the train, blending back into the crowd, disappearing into the city just another ordinary person, making the world a little better, one quiet act of kindness at a time.